Good morning, and thank you, Sashi, for inviting me. It's a tough task to talk after Professor Osterley because he made us realize how little we know as when we try to play around with this. I should make a full disclosure. I'm talking about QuantFin without knowing anything of finance. In full disclosure, and Srikanth is an old friend, he will relate that he knows this. I am a student of statistics. My PhD was also in statistics, and I figured out about 30 years back that people hadn't really started applying quant methods into statistics into finance. So I ended up doing finance. Because I still today, after being in this, doing this about 27, 28 years now, I still don't understand what traditional finance guys will say. That why do I need a double entry balance sheet? When my bank passbook, which is a single entry balance sheet, works perfectly fine for me. So that's my understanding of finance. So, and obviously over the years, in trying to do finance, I've also forgotten quant. So I don't know where I am and what I'm talking about, but I'll just try to talk a little bit about it. So the other thing that I also want to kind of say upfront is that unlike Professor Osterley's talk, when I spoke to Sashi, he said just highlight some of the things that I've been doing and some of the things that have been happening in the market without going into any specific problem or any specific research topic that was there. So that's what I would kind of use in that. So let me just kind of go forward. I'll skip this slide. This is something that I think has driven the whole story of finance and quant together, or the marriage. In fact, there is a slide, there's an actual reality of how quant and finance have come together in an actual incident, and there's an example on that. But I think one of the things that have happened, and all of these things have kind of happened. And I think since the 1970s, since essentially Black-Scholes and thereabouts, it's not that it just started there, it obviously was there even earlier. One can go back to about 200 years and you will still see the same thing. But I think in the last 50 years or so, the understanding, the impact, the interactions have become far more. A significant part of that has been driven by the huge benefit of the huge development in technology that we've seen. Something that, in fact, Professor Osterley mentioned there are certain things which, and most of the things that we use in QuantFin today, or the techniques, are actually nothing new. If you go back, Ito calculus was developed in 1950s. And nobody really knew about Ito calculus in that space except some exotic mathematicians till the 1970s when Fisher, Black and Myron-Scholes used it in their obviously seminal paper. And since then everybody starts talking about Ito calculus. Similarly, a lot of other techniques have been around for decades. The most common interest rate, one of the most common interest rate models before the Hull-and-White model came about, the Cox-Ingersoll-Ross process, is actually something which has been known in physics for over 200 years. It's a pressure law, right? It's just that what value of gamma you take defines a certain equation, and that's what's been used subsequently. So it's nothing new that people on this side have kind of talked about, but a lot of these, some things which we couldn't do because of the amount of technology, the computation power that was needed, which has changed, is something which has kind of brought this in. I'll start with an example, and this is how an actual practical problem comes in, and what do you kind of look at? This actually happened. So this was about 40 years back. Lufthansa was buying. Now nobody knows why Lufthansa was buying Boeing. Why was it not buying Airbus? So don't ask me that question. This was still pre-Berlin Wall breakdown story. So maybe the US was forcing them to buy it, for all you know. But the reality, and they didn't want the French company to survive. But the reality was this, and the interesting part for us was this part, that they had to actually pay $500 million. The cost was set at $500 million. This was still when Deutschmark existed. And the exchange rate was this was around the peak exchange rate, which was around 3.2. The chairman of Lufthansa at that point, along with most of his other colleagues, believed that the dollar had peaked, and therefore exchange rate had peaked, and the exchange rate would come down. At that point, the current 1-year dollar forward was slightly higher than 3.2. And if you put options on the Deutschmark, the cost was about 96 million Deutschmarks. this is information that was available. What does he do? So these are the choices available. And this is what were the implications of each of the choices. So there were like 5 choices that he had, or the company had. They could be completely covered, take a very conservative position, and basically say that we'll buy everything forward, or take the completely naked position, the riskiest position, and then you take a limited cover, partially open, buy put options, or buy US dollars. These are the 5 basic choices that they were available, and these were essentially the costs that they would incur depending on which choice they kind of took. So what does he do? Because all of it kind of do. Okay? I'll tell you what he did. That's also there. That's the next slide. But no, the point is, what does this hinge on? It basically hinges on a very simple argument. If I were in his position, if any one of us were in his position, our ability to predict where the dollar would go, or the Deutschmark would go, right? This is what he did. They opted for strategy 3, which is they took a 50% forward cover and left 50% open. Well, the problem is, we are criticizing this, and this is this is what happened. His initial gut reaction did come true. From 3.2, the dollar fell to 2.3. So essentially, the Deutschmark outflow was 1.375. With no hedge, it would have been 1.15. At the put option with the cost, it would have been 1.246. The board very promptly criticized him, and I don't know what was he still the chairman after this? I don't know. I mean, obviously, as I said, I don't know what was the European firm doing and this and all of that, but dollar was ready, why others wondered why he had not selected Airbus and all of that. That's obviously post facto. The problem is that how do I predict the exchange rate? And this was the fundamental challenge that kind of comes in this whole, an example like this, that it's easy to talk about this because, again, we are talking about this, the board was talking about this, the last 2 points are post facto. With 2020 vision, everything can be corrected, or I can always have a perfect solution. I'm looking forward, and therefore, given the point in time when I'm standing, how much of a correct decision, or how appropriate is the decision that I kind of take? So what does it kind of imply? And I'll just talk this one thing out here, and the rest are kind of straightforward. In hindsight, everybody is a genius. But there's this good example of a talking frog. And upfront, my apologies to all the ladies out here. It's just a joke that existed. But it happens to be like that. So, but nothing more than that. So the joke is, there was this 2 young, or relatively young, traders in the city of London. Happened to be 2 ladies who had gone out for lunch, like every day. On the way back, they meet. There are 2 anecdotes. This is one. They're walking by and there's somebody calling out to one of these ladies saying, "Hey, help me." They turn back and they see there's a frog. And that's the frog's talking. So that's how the talking frog story. There's a talking frog. So one of them says, "Hey, let's go." The other picks up the frog and says, "This is interesting. How is the talking frog?" And both of them are incidentally currency traders in one of the major investment banks. So the frog says, "Oh, actually, I am a star currency trader. A magician employed by a rival bank has turned me into a frog. But the escape route is that if a beautiful lady like you kisses me, I will kind of become normal again. And as a matter of as a mark of my gratitude and all of that, I'll give you enough tips to make a lot of money in the trades." So this young lady thinks for a few minutes and then puts the frog in her bag and walks up. So the other lady asks her, if you want to have it, why don't you go and kiss the frog and just risk it? So she says, "Well, I'll probably make more money out of talking frog." That's how difficult or how random it is to predict some of these things, in that sense that there is really not, the guy might have made a prediction, this lady may have made some money, but there was also an equally large chance that they wouldn't have. But definitely a talking frog would get her more money in that sense. And the other thing, the other example on how random some of these things happen is, or how difficult this become is, and this actually happened with the Japanese finance minister in Bank of Tokyo Mitsubishi. So the Japanese finance minister would come to visit the Bank of Tokyo Mitsubishi, and he was taken around the building. For anyone, if you walked into an investment bank, the obvious place where any visitor is taken, the showpiece is always the treasury. It's the most fancy area in the whole thing, with all your screens and everything. So this person comes up to a trader and says, "Oh, what are you doing?" "I'm trading on currencies." And he says, "How do you decide on it?" He says, "Well, we look at short-term, long-term, medium-term factors and all of that." So this gentleman says, "Oh, I'm very impressed and happy that you look at medium and long-term factors as well in deciding what currencies to trade and what values to take and all of that." And then he asks, I mean, this is typical politician, right? He doesn't know when to stop. You should have stopped there. He then asks, "So what are your long-term factors? How long are your long-term factors?" 4 hours. So that's, now what kind of a quant model would you drive to explain any of these things is a $1 million question, therefore. But the reality is that these things do happen, and we try to model some of these things and obviously in an incomplete world, which kind of then give us, sometimes we succeed, sometimes we don't. The best of people will succeed a few times, but you will fail. And in hindsight, I can always prove you wrong or right, whichever way I want to do it. But looking forward, what's the position that I have? This is the other example that I'm talking about. This has actually happened. So some of us in this room who were alive or who were born before this would remember that in 1982, UK went into a war with Argentina over a small group of islands called the Falkland Islands, somewhere near Argentina. God knows what the UK was doing out there. But this is what happened. They said carrier down. So this guy heard carrier down, and he thought an aircraft carrier had gone down, short sold, lost about 200 million pounds in the whole process. And these are challenges that kind of keep on happening. Now, what model, we talk about quant and all, what model will we be able to ever talk about to kind of explain some of this? By the way, my last couple of slides actually address some of this, because today we try to do that. We've done some work, and because people now talk about behavioral finance and basically behavioral impact of speeches, impact of behavioral techniques, and their impact on markets kind of stuff. So, okay, I'll kind of go quickly forward in interest of time. Statistics has been around, and all that we talk about today is basically, statistics is nothing but in a sense an application area, and in that sense, we've kind of now used it in very many different ways. One of the most early application areas was again in finance, was in the early 1700s, when basically the first Dutch insurance premium arguments were being talked about. That was kind of the first thing. Essentially, life expectancy and the expected payouts and all, that was talked about close to 300 years back in the Netherlands that the government had. Now, in some sense, we can, while we heard in the morning the earlier talk, which was pretty much on the stochastic process argument, diffusion process, and then the whole argument that, the Markov process holds, which is basically memoryless and all of that kind of argument. But there's also a large school of thought within the financial literature which kind of argues on a time series based thing, and increasingly the logic being of long memory. Andrew Harvey and all from Cambridge at some point kind of pioneered that school, which actually was kind of forgotten but gained a lot of traction post the global financial crisis. Because people, again, it's post facto, but people after the global financial crisis looked back and said, a similar crisis that happened 75 years back, which was the Great Recession. Now, obviously, in 75 years, all of that was kind of lost, but suddenly there was a lot of interest in this whole story that came about, which is, was there a long memory argument in that, and therefore, is there a thing? And it's not it's not completely independent. One could argue that one could kind of interlink the two, because there are processes where particularly as Professor Australia was showing us the standard geometric Brownian motion or the Brownian motion, that in the drift term we could actually factor in historical basis and time series, something like a Garchin mean kind of an argument that could kind of be brought in there. So you could kind of marry the two together to kind of get some applications which would have historical dependence, but randomnesses that kind of come along with that in that process, along with jumps and all of that kind of stuff that could kind of come in. So in some sense, the earlier argument was that these two were probably independent of each other. I think increasingly people have started to converge and believe in the fact that they're not completely independent. Yes, if you can control for one, the other would be, but on the whole, it's not a completely independent argument that can be looked at. Anyway, I just want to kind of highlight this and then talk about a few of the things that I think would be relevant to, would probably of interest to look at the wide range of applications, or a sample of the wide range of applications that can kind of be done. And this has really changed the whole equation. Today, the frequency and quantity of financial data that we can get has really changed the whole equation. Our whole big data story, I mean, I was asking a friend of mine who does work in big data and is supposed to be a fairly leader in that space, that what is new? And his answer was, well, because I haven't really seen anything new in terms of techniques that have been arrived at. Techniques existed. So his answer was the best I have ever heard, and I think should I hear a better one, I would kind of go with that, is that we now have better computing power, better techniques, better tools to address data at a much higher frequency. And he was giving an example that when we started studying statistics, we didn't even have calculators. The calculators were those facet machines, the handheld facet machines, and then all of that. So today we don't even use calculators. I remember when I first had my FX82 Casio calculator, that was a huge improvement in terms of handling data. Today, if I ask a lot of you, you guys will say, what is that? If I ask my kids, they'll say, what is a calculator? Why do I need a calculator? I mean, at best a phone, or otherwise the laptop. Why do I need something else? This two are kind of related, because essentially the other important argument of financial data is that there is really nothing called a correct data or a true data. Market data is a compromise based on all the information that you have at any point in time, which is why it changes. You see, the price of this bottle of water will not change between now and the next 10 minutes. But if this bottle of water was being traded in the market, in the very next second this could change, because that is a function of the information available at a point in time between the buyer and seller, and it's a compromise. And I sell because I believe the price will not go higher anymore. You buy because you believe it will go up. So based on the information available, you are making that compromise decision, and that compromise keeps changing. And that's a unique feature that financial data would have, unlike most other data points, which there is a true value, and therefore you can strive towards achieving the true value. Here there is nothing really called a true value per se. And then that's why whenever there's a trade, it kind of comes in. The second, which should not happen but still happens, is that ideally, in an ideal world, and this is the difference between what was being talked about, what Professor Australia was saying in the morning in terms of the ideal world, but in the reality of an imperfect world. When a trade happens, ideally the trade should be recorded at that point, and therefore I should have complete information. In reality, the trade information comes in as a bulk or at a given point in time, which is not necessarily mapped up with the other information that comes in. So therefore, there is inherent amount of noise that gets created. And sometimes it's impossible to segregate the noise from the true data. And what do you model? You can't really model on the noise. And even if you model on the noisy data, you actually end up having a problem, because are those results going to hold in the future? Because at the end of the day, everything on this is about talking about the future, and will this hold in the future? That's the fundamental question that comes in. So I'm going to skip this. There has been talk about it, so I'm going to skip this. I'm just going to kind of jump into this to kind of highlight a few things that I've done. Again, it's a risk that I'm taking. By no means this is any exhaustive. This is just some of the things that I've been doing over the years, which has applications. Simply because, and please don't treat this as the equivalent of a literature review. And the reason is very simple. I still strongly believe that if I were to ever do a literature review, that should be my last work, that should be end of career work. Because unless I've read enough number of papers, and unless I know the area well enough, I should not be able to do a literature review in an area, and I am way away from that. I can't claim to be anywhere close to that I've read everything around there. So therefore, it's a risky proposition, but it's just therefore a collection of some of the applications that we've done across a broad spectrum of stories. There is obviously some work that, given that I told you that I am a statistician by training, I started off my career looking at basically option pricing and interest rate modeling in a stochastic volatile environment. So basically, if I take the standard Black-Scholes, but if you have a stochastic volatility equation, something that basically was pioneered by Rogers and Shih and then Stein and Stein, if you had a Vasicek or an equivalent model in the volatility equation, and you correlated volatility with stock, how would that pricing work out? So that was one of the first things that we kind of looked at as a part of my PhD work. And then also extension of that was, I think, the question that Srikanth was asking, that if I also make, if I make my interest rate also stochastic, and therefore have a variance covariance matrix, so interest rate could be correlated to spot and volatility. So I actually have a three-way variance covariance matrix, and can I come up with some semi-closed form solution? And that was the idea of looking at that. So those are some of the things that we kind of started off with, extending that logic into also insurance or reinsurance, where could we marry a Cox process? So most of our stock processes and all of that are essentially what would translate to being a single random process, a single stochastic process. How about using a doubly stochastic process, which is nothing but, again, Cox process was talked about first, I think, way back in 1950s. But till about 1990s, nobody really applied that. And the Cox process model simply works in the thing that what is your uncertainty? So if we take an example, for example, if we take an earthquake, and if I take the intensity of the earthquake as a proxy of the financial damage that happens. Let's say there's an earthquake that has happened today and there's a financial damage. So that's your starting point, you know that. Question is, when does the next earthquake happen? That's random. And given that the current earthquake has at a certain intensity, what is the intensity of the next earthquake? That's also random. So basically you have a randomness on the x-axis, you have a randomness on the y-axis. You have essentially a doubly stochastic process that kind of comes in. And that becomes important in a lot of these kinds of catastrophic processes, where even if you start, given that I'm at a distress point today, just as a starting point, you can start anywhere, doesn't matter, but even if I start at a distress point, where will my next earthquake be? Because remember, an earthquake is a good example to take, because we also know that when earthquakes happen, there are aftershocks, and these aftershocks could be immediate, could be after a week, and or a volcanic eruption could happen immediately or may not happen for the next 100 years. And if it happens, we don't know what the impact of that is. So these are things that kind of were some of the early things, but some of the newer ones that I've looked at is, so broadly you can kind of put it into all of these arguments that you can kind of apply the application story into. But let's kind of look into the first. So one of the ones I will look at on both sides. So what we did so this is the story that we did. Obviously, this is a little old, the work. One can really look at it. This was done, I'm saying it's old, a little old, because we still had 46 banks in India at that point in time. Today our numbers are down to about 29 or 31 or something like that, because SBI merged, then the 10 banks, then the 6 SBI merged, and then the 10 banks were merged into 3, and then some of the private banks don't exist. So if you take that, it has come down. So essentially the whole idea was that, can I look at some kind of model by which we could predict NPAs? We all know the problem of NPAs, non-performing assets in banks, and then is there a way to kind of approach that? By the way, I have not put in the full details. I just wanted to kind of highlight this, but for anybody who's interested, I'll give you the links to the papers and all of that. So over a period, and this was a period when the NPAs in India were the highest, so we kind of looked at, okay, what would be useful to determine this and useful to predict NPAs in a bank, in a financial institution, and then remember that there are endogeneity issues in the data, because it is not everything is exogenous. There are internal factors which are affecting it. So controlling for those endogenous factors becomes important. So it's basic. So at some level, one could argue that this is a simple time series application, Yes, it is, but essentially in the context in which you are applying it, and then the market that kind of keeps on changing. So basically the GMM approach was kind of used, which again is something which has been known in quant methods and stats for a long time. It's just that a certain particular approach was kind of looked at due to the exogeneity problem and all of that to kind of address this issue. This becomes pretty interesting to look at because one of the stories that came up, value at risk is a standard risk measurement, at least market risk measurement model. I know the next talk is about credit risk and credit risk model, but standard market risk measurement mechanism is value at risk. But one of the things that value at risk assumes is essentially normality and the fact that there is no liquidity issue. Right? It assumes that liquidity is available at any point in time, so your ability to exit, enter is in an unconstrained environment. The reality is not that, and the 2007 crisis showed that, to us very clearly, that the liquidity crisis kind of can also offset significantly the value at risk argument. So the whole point is, does the value at risk hold or not? Or what kind of adjustments do we need to do to ensure that the value at risk can be kind of taken into account. The liquidity argument can also be taken into account to look at that. Remember, value at risk assumes normality, but essentially most assets are assets we know are non-normally distributed, which basically means that they have fat tails and they have skewness. Negative news is far more important in the market than the positive news, and that kind of skews up, and that creates that problem. So the classic example actually that went back even earlier in 1997 when LTCM failed. It's not that people didn't know or LTCM didn't know they were losing. It's just that with controlling about 70% of the market, they didn't have the leverage and the skew was so high that they did not know whom to sell it to. Because the guys who ran LTCM were one of them was a Nobel laureate even. And to say that they didn't know what they were doing was kind of... And one of the things that... their biggest mistake, again in hindsight, was that all their models were calibrated and parameterized using historical data. But subsequently, again with 2020 vision, we now know that was a period of historical lows in the credit spread market. So obviously all their estimates became much lower. And then their error margins were something like... So when they showed that the daily volatility was of $45 million on their portfolio, in hindsight, when the analysis was done subsequently, it was found out that the daily volatility was about $100 million. So obviously they were underestimating their whole risk numbers by 50% or over 50%. Net effect is what happened. But the argument out here is that the argument that we wanted to look at is kind of look at, can we adjust for the value at risk argument in some manner for liquidity? And there seems to be an approach, there seems to be an adjustment in terms of the Cornish-Fisher expansion, which allows to account for non-normality in the liquidity risk. So the idea in this work, or the idea in some case, was to kind of integrate these to say that, okay, can we kind of get a better measure which adjusts for liquidity also? So the story was to kind of look at, modify the LVAR measure or the LVAR measure to kind of show that in a liquidity constrained environment, obviously if the liquidity is there, this doesn't make sense. In fact, it's more expensive and it's useless. But in a crisis, your liquidity won't be there. And that's the biggest challenge. So when you test for it, you will actually have liquidity in the system, or relatively high levels of liquidity in the system. And therefore, this might actually seem to be a not so good outcome. But if you have a crisis, the first thing that will happen is liquidity will dry up. And then this becomes a more effective system. So to be able to sell this is that whole argument that it's not that what you would need today, but what you would need in the event a crisis actually happens. Because the first thing that crisis has shown us is that liquidity kind of dries up. And if you neglect liquidity risk or assume a pure Gaussian distribution and basically a normal distribution, you would land up severely underestimating the total risk. And then it's a worse off condition than not being covered at all. So you have three choices. Effectively, there are four choices. One of the choices, you're appropriately covered. That's a good part of it. If you are covered, sorry, the other two are if you are covered, but not adequately covered. And the second is you're not covered at all. Now, if you are covered but not adequately covered, so you're half covered, like the Lufthansa example, what happens? You've actually blocked up productive capital, but you've not blocked up enough productive capital. So when the crisis hits, you lose in any case, and you've also lost the opportunity to use this productive capital when the going was good. On the other hand, if you are not covered at all, at least when the going was good, you were making money. You were doing well. So being kind of underestimating and therefore being kind of half covered or something is kind of an even more suboptimal solution. Obviously, the most optimal solution is to be covered appropriately, but then that is where the risk factors kind of come in, and that's what we kind of looked at in this argument. This is something which we also looked at in terms of using derivatives, where we were basically talking about what kind of derivatives and can you kind of, one of the, and this was kind of based on the logic that how do you manage the commodity risk and here the foreign exchange risk to kind of look at a better outcome. But while we talk about risk and hedging of risk, and then we use a 2SLS argument to approach to kind of solve this problem. But the point is, while I talk about hedge out here, again, as Professor Austerlitz showed in one of his slides, remember when you do a hedge, you are implicitly doing speculation also. Not you, but your counterparty is implicitly doing speculation. So while the regulator wants you to use derivatives only to hedge, if that is the only objective, the market will not exist. So therefore, a speculation side will also exist, because after all, hedging is not risk reduction, it's risk redistribution. We tend to believe, or commonly we tend to believe that we'll hedge, which means we'll reduce risk. Yes, we've reduced my own risk or your own risk. But what we've done is we've actually redistributed the risk. And therefore, there is somebody who has to speculate. So what this kind of essentially showed is that, not only can I reduce my risk, can I also appropriately speculate to maximize my value? And this was explicitly for the firms which are exposed in the foreign exchange market. Remember, in Indian context, the foreign exchange market is actually very volatile. Now it's still one way, but there have been points in time when it's gone both ways, which is the rupee is depreciated, the rupee is appreciated. And therefore, in that scenario, you are actually worse off. Right? So if the rupee only depreciates and predominantly we are exporters of technology, or we are kind of exporting and therefore we are earning in foreign exchange, one would not really need to hedge. If you are only an importer, you would want to hedge. Because when you need to buy the foreign exchange is when you need to kind of be worried about. So for that, it was the kind of the hedging argument. But also, if you were an exporter, so if you were earning in dollars, which a significant part of the Indian industry does, and at least IT and some part of the Indian industry does, then it's not so much of a hedge in the current environment, but essentially it's a value maximization proposition. Can I also speculate? And whom do you speculate with? You need to kind of play it up on the other side with the people who want to hedge to kind of balance that equation. The same thing. So now, obviously, leverage. What one saw in that equation is that leverage plays also an important part. So, if you are exposed to a moderate increase in leverage, increase their hedging positions, and firms exposed to a very high increase in leverage decrease their hedging intensities. Because the more leveraged you are, you are really taking a position. You're not really hedging. You're actually speculating. If you are leveraging yourself way too high, which is also, by the way, risky. Because if you are too highly leveraged, your ability to unwind, deleverage is very low. And if something were to go against what you were thinking, the hit would be much, much larger. But yes, if you were strongly leveraged and if you were increasing your leverage on top of that, your need to hedge kind of comes down, and therefore your hedging intensity essentially comes down. It's also a function of whether you are a foreign currency borrower, or you're a bank who's kind of required to take the money, because again in India, if you're a bank, you really can't refuse a deal. You can only price it. You can't refuse a deal. So you can go and sell or buy anything from the bank. The bank really has no real right to refuse you. The bank can price you out. I mean, it might price you in a manner where it will not be adequately enough for you, and that can kind of happen. But therefore, the view changes in terms of that condition. There are transmission. One can look at productivity stories have been talked about in various cases, and bank efficiency is also something. Now, this has been talked about in various different ways for years, and various analyses have been done from basic analytical approaches to the DEA to other approaches. So the role of that has been something which has been very commonly used, or something which has been used, and some of these techniques have been extended into the banking sector to kind of look at what kind of the things that they do. It becomes more complicated because banks today are not just doing traditional activities, which is essentially a depository. Banks today are also engaged in a number of non-traditional activities, or what would be non-traditional to banks. Wealth management, demat accounts, derivative contracts. These were not really pure banking activities. Pure banking activities would be essentially deposits and advances. Right? So therefore, how do you also figure out the efficiency in some of them? And there is obviously a problem that happens, which is now the bank also operates on both sides. If I get a piece of information, whom do I use it first for? Do I use it for my deposit, or do I use it for my prop trade? I have a position for my client. I have an information, and remember, in the market, any information is valid the first time. Right? So now I have an information which will impact the position. If I use it on my portfolio, I benefit. And my shareholders benefit. And when I say the bank benefits, the shareholders benefit. But this comes at a cost of the depositor or the client who has entrusted you with that objective of managing his or her portfolio. On the other hand, if you use it there, if you use it on the client, if you pass on the information and if you do it for the client, your shareholders get adversely affected. So it becomes a dichotomous problem, a problem which a moral hazard problem and a dichotomy out there, that which one do you do? And therefore, the efficiencies, which efficiency are you going to measure, and how are you going to allocate between the two becomes a dynamic problem per se. And if I simply take any one of them, life is simple. Because then I have only one stakeholder to kind of address. I either address only my clients or I address my shareholders. I'm not addressing both. But the reality is I'm addressing both of them. And therefore, the argument of the question of efficiency becomes important. The banking sector becomes 5 minutes, right? That's what I checked my watch. So the banking sector makes it even more complicated because of the amount of regulation that remains in the system. It's one of the most regulated environments anywhere in the world. Obviously in India it's more than other parts of the world, but in any part of the world it's a lot more regulated. India, it's a lot more regulated simply because it's also a proxy to Australia, our standard pension system. Our social security system is proxied by the banking system. Because in India we really don't have a social security system. Right? And therefore, while on paper, whatever we say, we are a socialist country and whatever, in reality, we are the biggest capitalist country in the world. Because what you save today is what you have tomorrow. The government of the state is not there to support you in any manner. And therefore, the efficiency of the banks becomes that much more important. I'm going to skip. So there are other works that were there. I'll just go directly to the last one on the behavioral finance one. But just, this is, again, loan instruments and credit ratings. Credit ratings is supposed to help investors, right? Does that really help? And therefore, does markets, and therefore, how does the market react to an information? Does the market at all react? Because in reality, in an incomplete market, what happens is the information seems to leak out. So even before the announcement comes in, the market is already adjusted. So is there a role for credit ratings that can kind of be talked about? And we've looked at. So I'm going to skip this. Shadow banking is there also. So let me just talk about this one to kind of think. So this is something which has obviously started becoming interesting in the last few years. This was always interesting, by the way, but in academic space, it has now become interesting over the last maybe 10 odd years. I mean, when I first looked at it, it was kind of so strange to look at that. Traders track some things like what color of a tie is the central bank governor wearing while giving a speech. And based on that, they make a decision as to whether to buy or sell. Because the whole deal is, if I wear a pink tie, then the expectation of this speech is this way. I mean, this is real. I mean, this is not, I'm not making it up, by the way. This is absolutely real. You can go and talk to investors and they'll tell you that, what kind of, and who's speaking. Because the central bank in the US, is it the Fed chair, is the New York Fed chair, who's speaking? So all of these things kind of make a huge difference. This has got impacted in very many places. So the idea here has been that some of these has been available in text form, unlike in an objective quant method form. So how do I convert that and how do I extract that information into a quantifiable model? And then once I can do that, then the rest is straightforward, because then I have kind of a set of independent variables. I have a dependent variable which is market return, so I can potentially fit a relationship between that to test for it. So the argument has been that how can I kind of parse through this huge amount of text, and a lot of that actually comes in, where is it gone? On social media. There's a very famous example, I don't know if any one of you remember, 2 years back, how Reddit killed GameStop. The first time in history where small investors came together to kind of take on the investment bankers, and it was all done through a social media platform called Reddit. Right. So the importance of this, and then nobody was really doing anything. It was the amount of information or the statements that they were putting out there. So how do you parse this information and then convert that into some kind of an objective independent variable which then can go into a model, right? So, there are various ways it is used. People have started using, and then it can kind of impact all these things. And then this is just an illustrative set. There's no way exhaustive argument out here. And the argument has been that people have used what is called as a valence shifter argument, and then you kind of figure out these valence shifters from the equation. So are these words kind of there? And if these words are there in a statement, so if you take a base as 0 or base as 1, whatever you want to take, these would kind of amplify or de-amplify, negate adverse conjunctions to kind of give importance to a statement in a certain manner. Obviously, most of this work up to now has been done, and including ours, has been based on the English language, because unfortunately, if you take text from other languages, and that's a problem that we have, and if I use a Google Translator or something to translate it, it does not give me the exact, the tone and the sentiment in which the speech has been made. And both the tone and the sentiment is actually very important in understanding what is going on, because how are these words used and where are they used? So the approach is to kind of look at some of these and examine these impact of tone and a whole host of these readability variables onto the impact on financial variables. Significant impact on variables on index return and all of this. And it seems that Asian and emerging markets, when I look at it, and Eurozone also, these are all, when I highlight this, these are all where the speeches were available, or the content was available in English. We tried looking at it by using translators to kind of translate it, and then the results didn't really show up, because our guess is that the translation does not, because in the market we see an impact. Yet when we do this post-facto analysis, it is not showing up, and therefore our guess is the translation is not really happening. This is done everywhere. This was something which was talked about how you file your annual reports. The same story. Companies file annual reports, right? Climate, ESG is becoming one of the hottest things. So what do you put in your MDA? In your annual report, there's a section called the Management Discussion and Analysis. What goes in out there? 10K filings are the US annual report filings, where it's most objective. And also we looked at around the Paris Agreement. So the Glasgow story is not there, but this was around the Paris Agreement, what happened. So, there are all these words mentioned. There was a very high increase in the usage of these words in all of these talks and speeches around that time. And that kind of led to a fact that investors perceive higher climate change discussion in a negative light, even without any change in the fundamentals, because they believe that if you're doing that, we're going to lose money, and then there's lot much more. So for affected companies, this might be because there are non-financial disclosures. It's still early days. We've still been working around this. There's no causal impact of climate-related discussions, and the results are kind of associative at this point in time. But I guess as we go forward, this will kind of drive the whole equation a lot more. Again, where the data comes from in the US, probably the data is, this data is true, but if I were to look at European data, it might look very different, because the way climate is treated in Europe, or the importance that climate is, the attribution of importance to climate and climate-related issues in Europe is far higher than in a last of it. So let me just skip this and in the interest of time and stop with that. Thank you. I guess I am on time.